waiting for the identity panel. We've got 3 great speakers coming to talk to you. So we've got Trey, who is a neurodivergent Midlands-based speaker and multidisciplinary creative and public historian sociologist. He's doing his PhD with Kingston University, researching Northamptonshire's Windrush story, and will be giving us the talk.
You did that, Laura, well done.
Thank you.
There we go. So I'll start again. So we've got 3 great speakers. We've got Trey, who is a neurodivergent Midlands-based speaker and multidisciplinary creative and public historian sociologist. He's doing his PhD with Kingston University, researching Northamptonshire's Windrush story, and that is what he will be coming to talk to us on today. We next have Laura. They have just completed their MA in Public History at the University of York, having previously graduated from York with a BA in History. They will be talking about positive lives and collecting and archiving HIV and AIDS. And then lastly, we have Andrii. Andrii is a PhD candidate at Uzhhorod National University in Ukraine in the Department of Archaeology, Ethnology and Cultural Studies. They're going to be talking to us about past, present and future challenges for Ukrainian identities. So I'll now hand over to Trey and
Hi everyone. This paper is based on interviews I've conducted as part of my PhD about Northamptonshire's post-war Caribbean communities. Northamptonshire is a county that is both in the East Midlands and also in the home counties, composing of both countryside and industrial towns, including Northampton, Wellingborough, Kettering and Corby. From as early as 1948, Caribbean people arrived in Northampton looking for a better life. The beginning of this story starts with Winston Nelson, pictured here. He came to Northampton in 1948 after fighting as a pilot during the Second World War in the RAF. I interviewed his daughter Barbara. His wife, on the left-hand side, Phyllis Turner, was English, and their relationship opposed to prejudice faced by mixed couples in this era as well. They married in 1950. And this was also in a context of Black American GIs, who were many of them stationed in England and around the country as well. And some were stationed in Northamptonshire, leaving what they called brown babies behind, many of them raised by white mothers. Black GIs were stationed at bases in Northants villages like Hayford and also Crowton. Stories like the Nelsons represent a largely unwritten history of Northant's Caribbean diaspora. Through my interviews, there have been testimonies about jobs and housing that are not too different to what we have heard about big cities. So families of 6, for example, being told they have to inhabit one room. Also colour bars at pubs and clubs, and also racism in employment and education. For example, when I interviewed my godmother, Angela Jeffrey, who grew up in Wellingborough, she told me that her mother, Sylvia McLaurid's pictured here, did not train at Northampton General Hospital because in those days NGH did not employ black nurses. So when Sylvia came to Northampton from Jamaica in the 60s, she trained at St Edmunds on the Wellingborough Road, whilst others also trained in psychiatric nursing at St Andrews as well as St Crispin's. The stories of healthcare are stories about racism, but also stories of togetherness, where black nurses made friends that lasted all of their lives. Today, Northampton General Hospital likes to present itself as a very forward-thinking, relatively liberal institution, but it is, to my knowledge, also one of the only hospitals in the country that did not employ black nurses until the 1970s, whilst other places did. In fact, as a health minister in the 60s, Enoch Powell actively recruited black nurses from the Caribbean. Unique to Northampton is our shoe and boot industry as well. So when I interviewed Jenny Le Bon about her parents and her life, she told me that her mum and dad worked in Jinks shoe factory in Wellingborough, where the labour force was upheld by Caribbean workers. Jenny's grandfather, Ozzie King came to Wellingborough from St Vincent in 1963-64. Jenny was born in Kepsha Town in 1967 to her mother, Jean King, and her father, Reuben Le Bon, St Vincians of Indian heritage, who 3 generations before Ozzie had come to St Vincent from Madras in India as indentured labourers. Reuben Le Bon, I'm told, enjoyed partying like many Caribbean people in that era. In Wellingborough, there were blues dancers at Wellingborough African Caribbean Association, which still is on Rock Street in Wellingborough, just outside of town. Many of my participants have told me of their memories of watching blues dances, so frying pork, frying chicken, alcohol. In some cases, the children told by family members to go upstairs while their adults were dancing, scrubbing off the wallpaper. So some pubs were unsafe for black people and brown people, and this is what made the blues dances happen. So they were responding to a state of racism in the mainstream nightclubs, so they had parties in the houses and so on. My grandmother told me that her auntie, Diane, who lived on Vernon Terrace in Abington in Northampton, had blues parties in her house. People would pay on the door. Of course, there was food as well, so the curry goat, curry chicken, patties, plantain, ackee and saltfish, fried fish, etc., etc. And I heard stories of people emptying their front room for the night to make space for the dance floor, and they'd bring in the sound system, so massive wardrobe-sized speakers as well. My great-grandparents had parties too, and would bring their kids and send them upstairs with the other kids. Talking to my grandparents, they remember it being a wonderful time because of the community and that everybody was together. However, these discourses around employment and social life have mainly centred on the Caribbean elders, who have vastly different experiences to the Windrush children and the first generation British children. Trevor Hall, so that's Trevor here, started his music career as a selector DJ at 13 in 1970. In those days, Trevor told me that when Caribbean families went on trips to the beach, to very white spaces, very much in the language of what Corinne Fowler calls the green and pleasant land, there would be sound clashes between different towns. Each group always had their own cricket teams, domino teams, and they would compete on that level. Trevor talked about him linking up with Duku, who's that guy here, his birth name was Turner Molyneux, and also Eddie White at these sounds as they all came up together in Northampton. Trevor at 16 brought out his uncle's sound system, so that was Count Shelley, so Count Shelley sound. And at the heart of the sound system culture, there was an ethos of black pride, self-determination and spirituality. Like also the Mata Fankanta youth movement in Northampton, the inspiration came from the African continent. So in the early 70s, a more conservative Caribbean generation in many ways looked down upon their children's generation, who embraced a politics that rejected whiteness, respectability and looking European, rejecting straightening your hair, and so forth. In some ways, that Rasta culture that sat within Britain at the time, and also the Mata Fankanta Youth Centre in Northampton, was a challenge to the earlier generation who arrived by ship and plane in suits and trilby hats, looking to better themselves and taken in by myths of Britain paved with gold. So, the Mata Fankanta Many sound system events took place at the Matafan Centre on Sheep Street in Northampton. In the early 70s, Lee Bryan, pictured on the left there, and his friends drove a van from Northampton to the Gambia, and whilst there they were inspired by the Gambian kids who owned a youth centre. They brought that idea back to Britain, and when they returned home, the Matafan ethos started at Lee's house in Northampton, and every night his house was packed full of people wanting to know about their stories about Africa. Eventually, the group squatted a building called the Salvation Army Citadel, and they were confronted by the police. They fought for the building, and that is how the Matafan movement was born, starting with a group of youths wanting to better themselves, and did so against a culture that was happy to see young black people in states of subservience and disadvantage. And this was reportedly the first self-help black organisation in Britain. They were not about going to the state for help. Institutions like the local authority that they saw as enablers. Matafan basically means guard yourself against self-destruction, to articulate the material circumstances black youths impacted by state violence had. This was compounded by the judgment of their parents in a wider grift of respectability politics. This movement empowered black Northamptonians to do it for themselves and became a hub of vaster culture and sound system and a vessel for artists who would later perform in major cities. Additionally, the first black football team in Northampton was convened there, and that was called the Persuaders. Their ethos was self-help, not only challenged the white organisations, but also the other black organisations that wanted to be included into that system of whiteness. In large, these were the Windrush children and the first generation of British kids who were excluded by white people and their parents because they did not subscribe to the politics of respectability, including in some cases choosing to lock their hair and listen to reggae music, etc. By its very nature, it was a form of decolonisation that upset their Windrush elders and also white people. So far, I've had stories about jobs, housing, identity and activism. I've also had people talk about the trauma as well. So for the Windrush children, many were left in the Caribbean for many years to be raised by grandparents and other relatives before coming here. So that attachment trauma is not something many ever recovered from. Nadine White's film Barrel Children explores this. However, for those that were born here, other forms of attachment trauma presented. Karen Peart lived with relatives in the first years of her life in Northampton as her mother had to go back to work in America. What was supposed to be 1 month turned into a year with her relatives that she describes not as familial, but really equivalent to foster care. For Karen and for many of that age group, who are now in their 60s, growing up was traumatic. Their school experiences in many cases were about juggling education with survival from racism, and for many they were in fights every day. However, with whatever walks of life, the Caribbean stories of Northamptonshire have shown with both the elders, their children and their children were all very ambitious individuals with high standards and did not do jobs in halves. Northamptonshire had a Caribbean history since 1948, while Northampton and Wellingborough also had focal points in Northampton. Many Caribbean families lived in Abington, and in Wellingborough, that was in the district called Queensway. Meanwhile, further out to Kettering, there was not really a community, and I'm told that Caribbean people in Kettering looked to Northampton for belonging. In Banbury, which is on the Oxfordshire-Northamptonshire border, out in the sticks, the Arthur family from Barbados, one of the few in the area, had the option of Oxford or Northampton. Oxford too has its own Caribbean history. Britain published works about post-war Caribbean communities having large revolved around places such as Notting Hill and Brixton in London, Handsworth in Birmingham, and as well Moss Side in Manchester. My project centres on my home county, Northamptonshire, to descend some of those myths, perpetuated by the media that Caribbean people only settled in major cities, and does so through the production of new work of creative non-fiction based on oral history testimonies. So my PhD is not a history PhD, it's actually a creative writing one. In 2021, I joined my friend Shireen Ingram and her community group, which is called Northampton, where they were doing door-to-door hampers deliveries to Caribbean elders during the lockdowns. At their doors, the elders wanted to tell us stories about their lives, and that was one of the inspirations for this PhD. These are the people that lived, worked and thrived in Northamptonshire, and yet their story has been eclipsed by major cities. Here I'm drawing on the words of 3 generations of Caribbean people, both those that were born here and those that came here, to tell a history of my area between 1948 and 1985. And that really hasn't been told before. It starts with the original Windrush elders and that community, but also continues to include the children and also my parents' generation, that first generation of British kids who carved out their own spaces. Today, many of them still carry those stories in their bodies, challenging the system that still governed all of their lives, as Bob Marley sang in Concrete Jungle, no chains around my feet, but I'm not free. I know I'm bound here in captivity, and that hasn't aged a day since he sang it in 1973. And yeah, that's my paper, so thanks very much for listening.
Hello everyone, I'm Laura. I'm here to present my paper, which is based on my dissertation, which looks at collecting, archiving and exhibiting HIV and AIDS history in the UK. Just as a content warning, as shown by the title, I am discussing HIV and AIDS, which are incredibly emotional, upsetting and traumatic topics for some. However, I will be not going into too much detail. So what do we know about HIV and AIDS in the UK? The AIDS crisis, the 1980s, photos of Princess Diana embracing a frail, ailing gay man dying from an incurable virus. And of course, the Don't Die of Ignorance campaign, where the cold, capitalised letters spelling AIDS are chiselled into a tombstone, or the looming sight of an iceberg. Although many may assume that issues with HIV and AIDS are a thing of the past, the HIV epidemic continues due to stigma, and there is a vulnerability distributed by race, gender, class, and immigration status. Although there are medications to prevent the replication of the virus in the body, there is still no cure. Thus, it remains vital for public institutions like archives and museums to raise awareness not only about people who die from AIDS-related illnesses, but also that people living with HIV continue to be here. Time plays a significant role in understandings and experiences of HIV and AIDS. What has been described as AIDS time by Andrii Kepsha, she argues that time relegates people living with HIV to a position outside of time, and this is even further perpetuated with an end of AIDS discourse, which continues complacency and ignorance, suggesting that HIV is a gay issue or a 1980s issue. Now recently, it has been noted by various scholars that discourse and reinterpretation of HIV and AIDS history is currently happening, especially within the last 5 to 10 years. So this resurgence can be attributed to many different things. So for example, popular media, described by Ted Kerr as AIDS crisis revisitation. This is a phenomenon in popular media that narrates HIV stories to mainstream audiences. So some of you may have seen the TV show It's a Sin, or films like Bohemian Rhapsody and Pride. For many who lived through the 1980s and 90s epidemic, who were diagnosed during the time, who lost loved ones, they may feel more comfortable or ready to talk about their experiences. However, institutions like museums and archives must recognise that this is not a collective experience. While some may wish to reflect on the past, some may still feel anger or grief or stigma. And then there's the impact of medicine. Andrii Kepsha argues that we are now in a cultural moment amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic, which is revisiting HIV and AIDS history with a kind of nostalgia and remembrance. Advancements in HIV healthcare, such as antiretrovirals, PrEP and PEP, have transformed how HIV is experienced. So many now wish to see these presentations of people living with HIV. In the process of collecting, archiving and exhibiting HIV and AIDS history, I propose that these practices should be done with an adoption and application of an ethics of care and effect. So what are these? An ethics of care is a feminist approach to ethics which challenges traditional male-centric moral values to the extent that they exclude values that are usually culturally associated with feminine qualities of caring. Places like museums and archives, who interact with the public, would benefit from adopting a caring role, so that they not only provide education and knowledge to a public audience, but also they provide a safe, comfortable place for people to feel represented, heard and involved. With any topic in history that still affects people to this day, the topic should be dealt with care and involve these individuals and communities into the conversation. Not simply a synonym for emotion, Ahmed suggests that it's through affect, or how we respond to others, that services and boundaries are made. In regards to HIV and AIDS history, a topic that holds a significant amount of weight, emotion and stigma, it is important to consider affect and how through the presentations and collections of HIV have affected individuals, whether they were not or are affected by HIV personally. Whether working behind the scenes in an archive or a museum, or interacting with an exhibit or a collection, these experiences can be markedly moving, either negatively, evoking anger, trauma or sadness, or positively, feeling nostalgia and hope. In my dissertation, I specifically looked at how museums, archives and community projects have navigated and approached HIV and AIDS history in order to combat stigma, educate the public about HIV and AIDS, whilst also supporting and empowering HIV positive people and others affected. Here were some of my case studies. Now, due to the time that we have, I unfortunately can't talk your ears off about all the case studies. So for this presentation, I will be focusing on archives. In understanding what an archive is, it's important to recognise that it's not what it simply contains, but how records might relate to people alive and deceased. Jamie Lee uses the concept of the body as a framework to reimagine the archive as a form of multiple bodies of knowledge that are situated in regards to identities, representations and timescapes. By considering archives as affected bodies, especially in regards to HIV and AIDS history, we can better understand how these documents can influence and associate with affected communities presently. Acknowledging emotion and contact, Ahmed offers the definition of the archive as an effective multiple forms of contact. Even records relating to HIV and AIDS that are not interacted with, the way that they are collected, catalogued and cared for alter how we fathom and perceive these histories. In applying an ethics of care to archives, Caswell and Seifel suggest that archivists should be seen as caregivers, bound to records creators, subjects and users through a web of responsibility. As caregivers, archivists may not know the backgrounds of users of HIV/AIDS records and where they come from, but they can understand that these histories can be emotive and distressing for anyone. So it's important that archivists understand the affected nature of these records. In an archival context, an application of an ethics of care can come in various different forms. It can include having a quiet room or a prayer room. It can be warning users of distressing topics or offensive language in records. Or it can be as simple as having a box of tissues nearby. All these practices can help ensure that users of records can feel supported and welcomed. So how was my framework shown and not shown in these case studies? When using the Wellcome Collections online catalogue, I was easily able to look up HIV and AIDS, with them having an extensive collection, many of which are digitised. On seeing who is represented in these records, I was able to look up different groups, such as the deaf community. However, sometimes I did have to use outdated terms, such as prostitute, when looking up the topic of sex work. As you can see by the article in the top right, there are steps being made by the Wellcome to use more inclusive and up-to-date language, and so updates may be yet to happen with the catalogue descriptions. Having to use pejorative language when searching for marginalised groups may contribute to what Hartman describes as the second order of violence. Through this, groups can be reharmed, and we should try to diminish the potential consequences of this harm, especially in the digital context, where expanded access can highlight the impact of hurtful description. While the use of anachronisms may always be the subject of debate in academia and archives, what may need to be considered is the effect of using harmful language and what it may have. Not only with the use of language, archival catalogues and descriptions could be used to inform users of misinformation, offensive language and harmful views. This, I think, is an amazing picture. This has been employed in the case of this lithograph from the Black HIV/AIDS network of 2 women holding a washing line of condoms. The description reads, presumably the washing line was intended only as a means to display the different types of condoms. It could not have meant that the women had washed the condoms, as the wear and tear of washing and handling would have made the condoms unsafe. Providing this description adds context not only to the aesthetic choices of the lithograph, but additional information about and unsafe condom usage. Defining offensive content is challenging, as is determining to what extent is harmful, as perspectives may vary, so context is important. A way to expand context is to approach and collaborate with HIV organisations and charities who can give advice and guidance to specific topics that archivists may not know about. The Lothian Health Service archive was very different in comparison with the Wellcome. Having a lot less records digitised, the archive online was a lot less accessible to use. However, the archive contributes to an ethics of care through its adherence to collecting, preserving and archiving histories that may need more attention. Being significantly smaller, the archive is focused on locality, Edinburgh and the Lothian region, coordinating work with past and present HIV charities, organisations such as Waverley Care, the Take Care campaign and Lothian Gay and Lesbian Switchboard. The archive tries to keep in contact with these different organisations, asking for feedback and information. The archive has also worked to collect and preserve small artefacts that relate to HIV and AIDS activism, such as balloons, banners and condoms. The artefacts they have been collected because they are intrinsically connected to the written documents the archive holds. When I asked an archivist about the role of archives, they argued that accessing HIV records can be a really important way to reduce stigma, to put faces and people behind a virus, behind a medical condition, to humanise something that is being objectified and stigmatised. Collecting not only these objects, but oral histories, the Scottish names quilt, the Lothian Health Services archive focuses on locality, may have contributed to being caring, as it's been able to stay connected with HIV organisations and charities, to make sure these histories are preserved in a respectful way that considers both those who have passed away and those who continue to be here. For archives applying an ethics of care, it can transform the reading room space from a cold, elitist institutional environment to an effective, user-orientated, community-centred service space. To finish this presentation, I will leave you with this quote from Sarah Ahmed, who strains that archivists and scholars must learn to understand that the past is living rather than dead, as the past lives in the very wounds that remain open in the present. This presentation is focused on HIV and AIDS history, but to what extent can an effective framework and an ethics of care be applied to other histories that still relate to the present? Could archives and museums care more, or could they care better? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share a couple of my thoughts with this incredible audience. Hope you will enjoy, despite the fact it's a little bit different especially from the previous session. I would like to start my presentation with the words of a very famous Ukrainian writer, Las Samchuk, who fought for Ukrainian independence in 1970s, 1921, after the First World War, during the Ukrainian Revolution, and was forced to emigrate to Europe and later on to Canada to escape the Bolshevik repression. So that is why it does matter how one speaks, what God to pray, what kind of books to read. It does matter what the names of our streets are. It does matter either Shevchenko dominates or Pushkin. In this paper, I would like to investigate a process of formation or transformation of modern Ukrainian identity through the representation of history in the public sphere, such as names of streets or monuments, based on a Ukrainian historical background. So the paper is divided chronologically into three parts. The first part is the period of 1991-2013, that's approximately 20 years, the first 20 years of our independence, from the collapse of the Soviet system and as a result of Ukrainian independence till the Maidan, or Revolution of Dignity, in 2013. The second part, 2013 to 2022, from Maidan to the full Russian invasion, respectively, and the third one, that's basically the last year and a half. So, it is possible to describe the first period, the first 20 years, as a period of tolerance, coexistence, and the process of rethinking of the Soviet past and the national one. Ukrainian national ideas coexisted together with Soviet past, Soviet views, national historical figures were represented along with the Soviet ones. Monuments dedicated to Ukrainian political and cultural heroes stood next to the Soviet or the Russian one. So symbolically, Shevchenko was a neighbor of Pushkin, Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky stood next to Lenin, and Hrushevsky monument was placed on the Gagarin Street, or Lev Tolstoy on the Lesya Ukrainka Street. However, there was a difference between the eastern and the western part of the state. Why? So to answer this question, it is needed to explore the historical background. In the 19th century, Ukrainian territories were divided between two empires, so that's Austrian, later on Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russian Empire. The impacts of these two empires will be seen throughout the two centuries in architecture, religion, education, traditions, ideas, etc. So the Habsburgs left as much traces of their world in the West as the Romanovs did in the East, as will be analyzed later. So yes, as you can see, basically two empires and the Ukrainian territories divided between them. However, after the First World War, the same territories became a part of such states, four state-states: Poland, Czechoslovakian Republic, Romania, and of course the Soviet Union. Yep, that's, you can see three states right on modern-day Ukrainian territories. A democratic Czechoslovakian Republic developed the region culturally and economically when autocratic Poland and Romania persecuted Ukrainian national movement. But none of these states reached the level of destruction of the Ukrainian national past in a cultural and historical perspective as the Soviet Union, where cities were renamed. For instance, the city of Yuzivka, which was founded by the British businessman John Hughes, it was renamed into Stalino. Luhansk, a Cossack city, was renamed into Voroshilovgrad, that Voroshilov was a friend of Lenin, and so on and so forth. As well as the streets were. All the Tsar's imperial monuments were either destroyed or replaced. For example, a grave of Ukrainian writer Mykola Khvedevei was destroyed in order to make an amusement park on the spot. So the same policy continued in the western part of modern Ukrainian territories, which previously belonged to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Continued in the west after 1945, so after the Second World War, when these territories were incorporated into the USSR. So despite the communist repression policy till its collapsed in 1991, a democratic way of coexistence in historical perspective, in the public sphere, dominated in Ukraine. A huge changes occurred in 2013-2014 when the Revolution of Dignity and the Russian invasion took place. It's fair to name this period approximately 10 years in the context of public sphere as anti-Soviet. Why? As far as Russian Federation used the Soviet narratives to justify its invasion in Ukraine, the entire public sphere of history began its transformation. As a result of Russian manipulation in the sphere of history, as was mentioned before, the process of transformation of perception of the Soviet past began. For instance, such cities as Dnipropetrovsk, as you can see on the... Yep. Okay. Dnipropetrovsk and Kirovograd was renamed. Says Petrovsky on the left was a friend of Lenin and basically was part of that machine who destroyed and basically repressed millions of people. So the city of Dnipropetrovsk was renamed into Dnipro city, or Kirovograd, that's a Kirov. I suppose you can recognize the guy on the left with beautiful mustache. That's a friend of Stalin, Kirov. It was renamed into Kropivnitsky, that's the previous name of the city during the Cossack period. So, another aspect of this transformation can be traced comparing east and west parts of Ukraine, the eastern one occupied by Russia. As you can see, in Lviv, that's the western part of Ukraine, a monument of Stepan Bandera was erected in the city center. He was a national hero. He fought against the Polish autocratic regime, against Nazi regime, communist after the Second World War, and was assassinated in Germany, in Munich in 1959 by a Soviet CIA, let's say, and KVD. While in the east, a couple of new busts were erected. So yes, I suppose that the eastern part of Ukraine, you can recognize those monuments as well. They were dedicated to Stalin. So these two historical figures of the same period, one who fought for Ukrainian independence and the other one who destroyed, basically. The other example is from Kyiv city center, but the same processes occurred throughout Ukrainian territories. It was called Leninopad or Lenin falling, literally. And here is that's the very city center where revolution took place. But that's my favorite one from the city of Odessa. How they changed the monument to get it to Lenin into, as you can see, that way. Yeah, very symbolic transformation. If you know who little Anakin Skywalker become, and even inspire the next generations to do the same. So let's move to the last part. After a Russian full-scale invasion in February 24, 2022, the process of transformation continued. However, it changed from the anti-Soviet into anti-Russian in its context. There you can see some of many examples. During the last year, a square dedicated to Lev Tolstoy was renamed into Ukrainian Hero Square, Institutional Street to heroes of the Maidan, and Air Force Avenue of the European Union. Or, now the examples, that's the Red Loom Street, let's say, was renamed into Winston Churchill Street. A Russian writer, Nekrasov, was renamed into Zenida Tulub. She was also repressed by the communist regime, and the Gagarin Avenue was renamed into Leonid Kadeniuk, that's the first Ukrainian astronaut. And the last example, yeah, I suppose that's my favorite, that's from the previous month, in August. It was changed, there's the mother homeland in Kyiv. The coat of arms was replaced, the Soviet coat of arms was replaced into the Ukrainian trident. And yeah, as you can see, the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 and 1921, and it's one of its leaders, Simon Petlura, new monuments, which were erected in central part and western part of Ukraine, and at the same time, the eastern part, eastern part of Ukraine, there are still a lot of monuments dedicated to the Second World War, but there is a small difference between Western Europe and the monuments in Western Europe, because as you can see the dates 1941-45. So the events from 39 to 41 did not exist in Soviet imagination of the Second World War, just because they occupied the western part of Ukraine and the part of Poland. So the war started in the Soviet Union just in 1941. That's a quite interesting thing. So yes, a very interesting example is the Crimean Peninsula. The process of its conquest and subjugation by Bolshevik in the late 18th century, but the Bolshevik terror in 1920s and especially the deportation of Crimean Tatars, indigenous people in 1945 transformed the region. Almost 80% of the local names of the cities and villages were changed into the typical Soviet ones. So the Tatars' history of the region was obliterated, and the situation is still the same now. To end up my presentation, I would like to demonstrate a couple of examples from a small town of Uzhhorod, the most western one, right on the border with Slovakia and European Union. Here you can see how the Soviet monument was delayed from the Ukrainian European Union border in 2022, and later on a Pushkin bust as a symbol of Russian imperial past was replaced. However, at the same time, national Ukrainian heroes as well as the local ones, Taras Shevchenko Dukhnovich was the author of the first Ukrainian book in the region, and Augustin Voloshin was the president of the Carpathian Ukraine in 1939, who fought against Hungary, an ally of Nazi Germany. And these are standing next to Czech, Slovakian, Austrian, and Hungarian ones. So Tomáš Masaryk is the president of Czechoslovakian Republic, Štěpánek is the Slovakian national hero, Maria Theresa is the empress of the Austrian Empire, and Sándor Petőfi is a national hero and poet and the soul of Hungary. So even more, one can find a very interesting and funny mini sculptures in the town. You can recognize the Mozart and Napoleon or Houdini, or for a lot of others, Michael Strang, a famous figure, I suppose, of 1945 during the Second World War, a Statue of Liberty, Andy Warhol, whose parents were from the region, and many others. So the sculptures that form a global and national worldview of the locals and the same time. So to conclude, firstly, it's possible to single out three waves of changes: 1941, 2013, 1322, 22 till now. That's tolerance and coexistence, anti-Soviet and anti-Russian respectively. Secondly, there was and still is a difference between East and the West, where different historical narratives, heroes and events are represented in public sphere. And thirdly, and finally, despite the separation from Russian Soviet culture and replacing it with the Ukrainian national one, a world culture, events and heroes are represented in the public sphere, creating a modern Ukrainian identity connected to not just their neighbors, but the rest of the world as well. So I would like to end up my presentation with the same words as I've started with. It does matter what the names of our streets are. Thank you very much.
Cool, so we've now got about 15 minutes. So if there are any questions anyone would like to ask, just stick your hand up and I will direct Hope to come with our roving mic. And then we'll pass this mic to our brilliant panellists, and they will be doing their best to answer your questions. Ben.
I have so many questions, they were all brilliant. Not the questions, the presentations. A question for all three of you, because you all touched on sort of local stories that maybe they don't sit outside the wider national narrative, but they've maybe not been as included. Is there space in your research and what you're doing to sort of link it all back in, or are you looking at these three examples kind of outside of the wider narrative of what's going on nationally, particularly, Trey, when we were talking about big cities versus smaller areas?
Yeah. I'm doing my best to decentralise London, but seemingly London seems to act like it's the centre of the universe most of the time. But yeah, when I do write my thesis, I think it's going to stay as local as much as possible. But I do realise that some people came to Northampton and Wellingborough through London, via London. So in the late 60s, for example, there was more of these new housing developments being built, and many people did move from London, as we call them, the London overspill population. Not just Caribbean people, but many members of the white working class communities in Northampton and Wellingborough that have been there since the 1960s. Well, also part of that overspill that also happened in Basingstoke as well, and also in Banbury. So I think as much as possible, I'll try and not talk about London, but often, basically, sometimes it might come back to that. Yeah.
I know I only touched on archives, but one of kind of the outcomes and arguments I had in my dissertation was that a local focus seems to work very well with HIV and AIDS history, because the more general you get, I suppose certain voices are heard louder than others. And I think one of the great things about the Lothian Health Service Archive is because they have that local focus, and they have to have that local focus as well because they are a smaller institution in comparison to the Wellcome Collection. The Wellcome Collection's actually funded some of the Lothian Health Services Archive projects regarding HIV and AIDS. But a local focus works better because you can stay connected with those certain groups, and I think locality and space and place play a big role in understanding HIV and AIDS as well.
It's a very serious talk about archives. I do have just about my personal experience. I've been working as a teacher for 8 years, and on the one hand, the other, I've been working as a tour guide for people from different parts of Ukraine. And I'm from the most western part, but I've studied in Kyiv, that's 800 kilometers. My sister studied in central or eastern part, that's 1,200 kilometers. So I was always traveling all around Ukraine, and I have a lot of friends mine from different parts. They are speaking different dialects, and I can recognize from which region they are from. I'm trying to figure out those different Ukrainian identities based on some local research, because in my region you can just travel 100 kilometers and you will not understand any word because they're speaking Hungarian or Slovakian or Romanian or some kind of mix. At the same time, I was highly inspired by my mom and grandmother because they worked in elementary school with, gypsy people. So there are a lot of stereotypes, at least in our region, concerning this nationality. So I was trying just to reverse it, to change this perception of these people, and then I was going on and on. So I'm trying to research some local features of my region, but at the same time I'm trying to understand the worldview of those people from the eastern part of Crimean Tatars, as those maps of Crimean Peninsula, basically it's from a t-shirt of a friend of mine. He's Crimean Tatar, he's Alim, he is trying to deal with all these problems. So it's more about my personal experience in my life, and just talking to different nationalities, different religious, ethnic groups, and so on and so forth. Don't know if it makes any sense, but I do. So, thank you.
Cool, so do we have any more questions? Just over here.
Hi, I have a question for the last presentation about the monuments. I was wondering if you could touch on or give some context on how these monuments are erected, or who funds these. Is it government, is it political, or is it community groups? And how does that kind of influence what gets portrayed and what doesn't get portrayed, or what gets changed? Those are some fascinating photos also. That was really, I love the Darth Vader one.
Thank you. That's all about community. That's a strange thing, but it's all about the community inspired by the Western countries, because when I was quite small, 10 years, we used to just sit on the bicycle and went to Slovakia to buy some cookies and just came back, because it's one street right on the border. So we were inspired from the West, but we're always trying to apply on local ideas. We do have a lot of connections, especially with Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary, so a lot of national heroes, some Hungarians, when we had excursions in our region, they were like, okay, that's our history, okay, that's our common history. And at the same time, Ukrainians from the central part of Ukraine, when they came to our region, they were, what's the monument? Who is that? That Masaryk, that Czechoslovakian president? They completely didn't know anything about that. So yes, that's all about the locals, their initiative, their views on how it should be. So tolerant, the coexistence, and in religion. In one family you can have an Orthodox, Catholic, atheist, and some kind of pagan views on based on Buddhist, I don't know what. So the same thing is about the language, and a lot of people, they do have relatives in different countries, especially the neighbors. So yes, it's not about the government, it's all about the people. Thank you.
Anyone else have any more questions? Yeah, up at the back.
Hi. Yeah, just for Andrew. So, so I was saying just for Andrew, in regards to the, I think it was the Revolution of Dignities you suggested. So I think many could notice the parallel between the removal of statues in Ukraine and those in the West recently. So have you drawn any parallel into that at all?
I think that's a very hard question. That's the whole events of this process in 2013-14 is still. There are a lot of people who are not ready yet to speak about that. They need some time, because after a couple of years, the conflict, let's say, started, and now the full-scale invasion. So we did not have enough time to think about those events, and we had to just dive into another one, a quite tragic one, let's say. So I'm not sure I can reply to your question, because at that moment I did have friends in Kyiv who participated in those, all those events, but I was in Uzhhorod and we also did different things. I hope that you
some kind of FBI not listening, but we also did have fun, and I think we still need some time. We still need some time just to think about it, to rethink, to yeah, that's seems like 10 years already, 2014, 13, 14, but a couple of years later, COVID, then the war, and it seems like from the previous century for us, but we are not ready to just to analyze or to think or to not always maybe even talk about that. So I'm really sorry that that's a response to your question.
Anyone else with any questions? Yeah, down at the front.
Sorry, question for Troy. I wanted to know more about how the creative writing aspect of your PhD is going to turn out. Like, what will it turn into a novel, or tell us more about that?
Creative writing is very, it's as specific as it is diverse. So in terms of the thesis, particularly, I chose creative non-fiction to present that. So basically, I can interview as many people as I want and write inspired from what they say. Rather than on a sociology PhD, you'd be told you must do, say, let's say 10 interviews, and you analyse the interviews, and then you have to show the transcriptions. I don't effectively have to do that. I can just write and quote if I want to, but not if I don't want to. So that's with the creative writing side. After the thesis, yeah, you're absolutely correct that, because I've got all that data, the possibilities are endless. Effectively, there could be novels, there could be radio plays, there could be poems and stuff, documentaries, which is something I'm interested in as well. So yeah, creative writing, because at the moment I've got about 60 hours of interviews. I've not finished interviewing yet, and that's about, I've done about 56 people across 3 generations of Caribbean people in Northamptonshire, and they've all told me very different things about their experiences. So yeah, creative writing. The thesis is just like one little thing. And my supervisor even said, yeah, try this as a side project, basically, because what comes after the thesis probably have more impact. So I'm not a novelist by any means, but short stories, potentially poetry, theatre, period dramas. So think about Steve McQueen's Small Axe, and possibly doing the equivalent, possibly about Northampton, but even just Caribbean people, lives out in the sticks. So I'm not sure if any of you have seen things like the Sister Boniface Mysteries, which is the spin-off to Father Brown. And that programme has a Caribbean lead, a co-lead, and that's set in Oxfordshire in the 50s. And again, like stuff like that probably would be of interest. So there's actually more stuff being done in terms of black representation on the small screen, being done not only in period dramas but also rural crime dramas than there is in stuff on the contemporary. So things like Violin that came up not so long ago are probably an anomaly compared to what's been done in period dramas. So think about Amor Sante's film Belle, Sanditon, the Jane Austen adaptation. Yeah, I think period dramas are doing a lot more, which is why I want to think, because they're the ones that have been criticised the most for being just about white people. So, so yeah, creative writing. Yeah, it's as specific as it is diverse, which I'm not sure is helpful to what you're asking, but yeah, there's quite a lot of possibilities with that.
Hiya, a question for Laura. You talked about archives as places of care and even kind of emotion and affection. I wondered if in your conversations with archivists, how they responded to that. Were they surprised by it, or did they see it as part of their role?
Yeah, thank you for your questions. It was very different depending on where you were talking to. I'm thinking of generally, because I had a local focus and then a general focus. And with the more local one, with the Lothian, they were much more in tune with it, I suppose. So theories of ethics of care and affect are quite recent, but they've been around, and there's been a lot said about it, but there's still a lot to do, or a lot to actually come into play. It's just kind of amongst academics at the moment, so it hasn't really come into practice. Whereas the Wellcome collection, that was a bit awkward, I'm going to be honest. There were some things that they were more in tune with than others. So one theme I didn't talk about in my presentation was the sanitisation of HIV and AIDS history. And I asked about that question, and I got two different answers from both case studies. And the Wellcome collection were very much more it was a very awkward conversation, let's just say that. They were very much thinking about, oh, there's only so much we can show, and like, oh, we don't want anything too dirty and brash kind of thing. And for me, I felt that to be caring is to represent as much as possible. And I think the most personal and activist-driven histories do often aren't always palatable for broader institutions like the Wellcome collection. So, there is a lot of HIV/AIDS material that is, has frontal nudity and slurs and swear words and things like that. And if you don't show that, then you're missing a massive chunk of people. And those were the types of materials that community people were getting. It wasn't the, I think that's why the Don't Die of Ignorance campaign is latched onto a lot by archives and museums, because everyone kind of knows it, everyone kind of remembers the advert, even the people who weren't around that time, they kind of know about it. But yeah, there was definitely a difference, and I do think it's easier to care on a smaller level. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Goes back to respectability politics, doesn't it?
So I think we've got time just for one more quick question, and then we'll let you guys all head to your next panel of choice.
Hi, sorry, this question's for Trey. Through your interviews you did with the three generations, did you find that because they were based in a rural setting, that their experience differed a lot from, like you said, the large Windrush in London, like the Londonification? Do you think that it gave you a different perspective to the diaspora?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, now Northampton is not necessarily, Northampton town is not rural, but when they came, there was more greenery. So when my grandparents first came from Grenada in '62, I believe, there was more fields and rural in Northampton. But if you went there now, it was quite a built-up town. But their experiences, I think, did differ. I think the racism in Northampton back then was a lot more insidious. In the sense, you go to London, and you'd see no Irish, no blacks, no dog signs on shop fronts and things like that. In Northampton, they said they didn't have that, but then if you went to go and board in a room, they'll say, no, we don't want any black people here. And Irish people have said similar as well. So Irish Northamptonians in the 60s experienced similar, but the racism and prejudice wasn't so explicit. The practice was still the same, but wasn't so explicit. But I think as well, in terms of the music and stuff like that, it was all very similar to what was happening in London and in Birmingham, but there was also distinct differences as well in terms of I guess the microaggressions, but I don't particularly like that term because their impact isn't micro. But yeah, so the rural racism, it's still violence. It's still violence upon the body. So I don't like to say it was less bad, because in Northampton as well, there was teddy boys in Northampton. People being chased down the street with razor blades, white men chasing black kids down the street with razor blades. One of my participants said that in the 70s she was chased through a field by about 20-man strong gang of National Front members, and I think she was a child at the time as well, and that was just routine. So you've got the Windrush generation, so the originals that came. I've been less critical about the racism because I think they still think that they were invited here and they're not allowed to complain, and that's sort of about the whole ideas of respectability and things like that. Whilst their children, on the other hand, who were born here and have grown up British, are a lot more outspoken and critical of it. So yeah, there was similarities, but there's also a lot of differences as well. And what doesn't get talked about are the good things. So you look at all the stuff that's in the media about Windrush, and it's all about racism in employment, in education and stuff like that. But they don't tell you about all the good stuff that happened as well. And the community building, which did happen in Northampton and in Edinburgh. And those communities still exist today, even in the face of gentrification that's happened. So one of my colleagues is doing not doing a PhD, but is doing research on the gentrification of happening in London. And what he's found as well, even speaks to whiteness. It's not just a history. History doesn't exist in a silo. It's sociology, it's politics, it's criminological as well. And I think the more we think wider, the more impact the research can have as well. So I think I'll just leave it there because I'll go on forever.
Cool, so if we could all just give our brilliant participants we've got the final panel session starting in about 5-10 minutes, so you should all have enough time if you need to go to the toilet, and if you're looking to head upstairs to the treehouse. So yeah, enjoy the next session.